The rain in the city didn't fall so much as it hung in the air, a fine, cold mist that soaked through everything. It was the kind of afternoon that made the world feel muted. The sounds of traffic dampened to a low, steady sigh. Inside the grand, old Emerson concert hall, the silence was different. It was a thick, velvety quiet, the kind that only exists in empty places built for sound. Victor Kellen stood alone in the center of this silence. To anyone who loved music, his name was a landmark. His hands, now resting at his sides, were insured for millions. But in this moment, they just felt tired. He had flown across an ocean to be here, to perform tonight for a sold-out house that would hang on every note. But right now, the thought of all those expectant faces, the rustling programs, the weight of his own reputation, felt like a heavy coat he needed to take off, if only for an hour. So he had come early, sending his assistant away with a quiet word. He needed to meet the piano, just him and the instrument, without an audience. The stage lights were off, only the dim, golden work lights were on, casting long shadows from the music stands. The great, black grand piano sat waiting like a sleeping beast. He sat on the bench, the leather cool through his suit pants. He didn't play one of his famous, fiery pieces. Instead, his fingers found a passage from a complex modern composition. He was struggling with a tangled web of rhythms and dissonant chords. The notes were sharp, cutting through the quiet, then melting into the hall's famous acoustics. He played a phrase, stopped, muttered something under his breath in his native language, and played it again. It was work. It was problem solving. It was, he thought with a slight pang, not very much fun. He was in the middle of this frustrating loop when a new sound entered the space. It wasn't a musical sound. It was a soft, hesitant shuffle, the gentle, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a cane on the polished wooden floor of an aisle. Then, the slow creak of a door hinge. Victor's hand stilled on the keys. He turned, peering into the gloom of the hall's seating area. A young woman was making her way slowly down the center aisle. She moved with careful purpose, one hand trailing lightly along the back of a velvet seat, the other guiding her with the white cane. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17. She wore a simple, dark coat, her hair damp from the mist outside. A strange, protective instinct rose in Victor. This was his private time. But watching her, he felt no annoyance. There was a calmness about her, a quiet dignity in the way she navigated the space. She wasn't lost in a frantic way. She seemed to be feeling her way with intention. He stood up, the movement making a soft noise. She stopped immediately, her head tilting, listening. "Hello?" Victor called out, his voice softer than he intended, respectful of the hall's quiet. "Hello." She answered. Her voice was clear, not timid. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought the hall was empty." "It's all right," Victor said, walking to the edge of the stage. He didn't jump down. He didn't want to startle her. "Are you looking for someone?" "The doors aren't officially open yet." A small smile touched her lips. "My uncle. He's the head caretaker here. He lets me come in sometimes, before the crowds arrive. I like to sit and listen to the quiet. It sounds different when it's empty. Bigger." Victor understood that perfectly. He saw then that she wasn't looking directly at him, but a little to the side. Her focus turned inward, tuned to sound. He realized she was blind. "I see," he said, and then mentally kicked himself for the phrase. But the girl didn't seem to notice or mind. "Your uncle is a lucky man to have such a quiet job before a concert. It gets very loud later." "I know," she said, her smile growing a little. "I come to the concerts sometimes, to listen. The sound from up there." She gestured vaguely towards the balconies. "It's like being wrapped in it." Victor felt a familiar, professional curiosity. Most people talked about seeing a performance. She talked about being wrapped in the sound. It was a musician's way of listening. "Do you like music?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "More than anything," she said simply. There was a weight to the statement that went beyond a teenager's hobby. He looked from her to the magnificent piano behind him. An idea, whimsical and kind, formed in his mind. He was Victor Kellen, and this was a young girl who loved the silence of empty halls. For a moment, he wasn't the maestro. He was just a man who could offer a small, beautiful experience. "You know," he said, his tone turning light, almost playful, "since you're here, and the piano is right here, would you like to try it? Just for fun. No one else is around." He expected hesitation, shyness, a polite refusal. He expected her to say she didn't play, or that she was afraid to touch such an expensive instrument. But she didn't. Her face, which had been peacefully composed, lit up with a sudden, bright interest. It was like someone had turned a light on inside her. "Could I?" she asked, and there was no fear in her voice, only a keen, eager hope. "Of course," Victor said. He hopped down from the stage, a move that felt younger than his years, and gently guided her to the steps leading up to it. "Mind the steps here. There are 3. He didn't take her arm, but let her find his offered elbow, letting her control the contact. Her cane tapped up each step. On the stage, the space felt even more immense. The piano loomed larger. Victor led her to the bench. "All yours," he said, stepping back to lean against the piano's curved side, his arms crossed. He prepared himself for the simple, uncertain plinking of someone who didn't really play. Maybe she'd pick out a tune with one finger. Maybe she'd just press a few keys to feel their weight. It would be a sweet moment, a nice story to think back on later. A small kindness on a rainy afternoon. The girl sat. She didn't immediately put her hands on the keys. First, she let her fingers spread out and lightly, so lightly, brushed the fallboard, the smooth wood above the keys. Then she traced the edge of the keys themselves, from the low end to the high, as if reading a map. She leaned in slightly, her ear tilted towards the instrument's body. She was listening to its silence. Then, she settled, her back straightened, not stiffly, but with a natural, poised alignment. She lifted her hands and let them hover just above the ivory. It wasn't the tentative hover of a beginner. It was the poised, confident readiness of a diver about to enter known waters. Victor felt the first faint prickle of something unexpected. This wasn't the body language of a curious visitor. This was the posture of a player. Her right hand descended, not to middle C, not to a simple, safe note. Her fingers curved, and she played a chord. It was a low, rich, minor chord, deep in the piano's belly. The sound didn't just start and stop. It bloomed. It filled the hollow silence of the great hall, vibrating in the air, in the wood of the stage, in Victor's very bones. It was a sound of profound sadness and beauty, held perfectly, and then let go to fade naturally into the dark. The simple, kind smile froze on Victor's face. The casual, relaxed feeling he had evaporated. His arms uncrossed slowly. The girl listened to the last vibration die away. Her head bowed. Then, without a word, she began to play. The sound that came from the piano was not what Victor expected. He had braced himself for a clumsy children's song, or maybe a few shy, disconnected notes. What he heard instead was a deep, resonant hum, a single chord that seemed to pull all the quiet of the hall into it. The girl's fingers had found a home on the keys without any searching. They settled into a position of strange, natural authority. Her body was still, poised not with tension, but with a kind of deep listening. She was waiting for the echo of that first chord to live and then die completely in the vast space. Only when the last whisper of sound had vanished did she move again. And then, she began to play for real. The first few notes were slow, deliberate, and heavy with feeling. They were the opening of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. Victor knew it instantly. It was a piece he had played himself 100 times, a stormy, dramatic work that many young pianists attempted, but few truly understood. It was not a piece you just knew. It was a piece you had to feel in your bones, in the pit of your stomach. He watched, his professional mind switching on despite his shock. Her technique was not perfect. A trained teacher might have noted the slight curve of a finger, a wrist a little too low. But what flowed from her hands made any small technical flaw utterly meaningless. She played not just the notes, but the space between them. The famous, thundering 3-note motif crashed through the hall. But it wasn't just loud. It was desperate. It was a cry. Then, the softer, wandering melody that followed wasn't just pretty. It was lonely, a single voice lost in a huge, empty landscape. She wasn't reading this from a page in her mind. She was rebuilding the piece from memory. Yes, but it was a memory made of emotion, not notation. Victor found he had stopped breathing. He was a critic, by nature and by profession, of every sound he heard. His mind was always working, analyzing, comparing. But that inner voice, the one that always had a comment, went completely silent. It was simply swept away. He stopped looking at her hands. He was drawn to her face. It was serene, completely focused, but not with the strained concentration of someone trying to remember what came next. Her expression changed with the music, a slight tightening around her eyes during the tense, anxious passages, a softening, an almost imperceptible tilt of her head during the fleeting moments of sweetness. She was not performing. She was experiencing. She was somewhere else, and the piano was the vessel taking her there. This was the difference. Victor realized with a jolt. This was what he had been missing in his own playing for years, what he chased in practice rooms and on stages across the world. For her, there was no separation between the player and the played. There was no audience, not even her own critical self. There was only the journey from silence into sound and back again. The music built, layer upon layer. Her small frame seemed to gather a surprising strength. The powerful left-hand chords were solid, anchoring the wild, right-hand flights. The hall, which had felt so empty before, was now completely full. It was filled with a story she was telling without words. He thought of his own performance earlier, the frustrated, technical work on that difficult modern piece. He had been solving a puzzle. This girl was not solving anything. She was revealing a secret. She was showing him what the music actually was, underneath all the practice, the fame, the reviews, the pressure. A deep, physical reaction began in Victor's chest. It was a tightness, a coiled spring of pure feeling. As the piece drove towards its final, furious climax, the sensation spread. It was awe, yes, but it was more than that. It was a kind of heartbreaking recognition. It was the clear, shocking understanding that he was in the presence of a rare and raw truth. The final chords arrived, those crashing, definitive declarations of doom. She played them with a power that seemed impossible for her slender arms. The sound was immense, a wave that hit Victor in the chest. And then, the last, deep, ringing low note. She held the pedal, letting the single note vibrate, the crown of all that had come before. Then, silence. Not the empty silence from before. This was a new silence, a charged and living quiet. It was thick with the ghost of the music, vibrating in the air like heat after a flame. The girl's hands lowered slowly to her lap. Her shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. She was coming back from that faraway place Victor tried to swallow, but his throat was tight. He tried to think of something to say, something professional, something encouraging from the great maestro to a talented child. All the words that usually came so easily: beautiful touch, impressive memory, very musical, turned to dust in his mind. They were not just inadequate, they were an insult to what had just happened. Because what had just happened was not about being very musical for a blind girl. It was about a musician of profound, instinctive depth who happened to be blind. He became aware of a faint trembling in his own hands. He clasped them together to steady them. But the tremor was inside him, too. It was in his legs, in his core. It was the tremble of the earth after something monumental has passed by. He, Victor Kellen, who had received standing ovations from kings and queens, who had argued with famous conductors, who believed he had heard every possible way a piano could speak, was literally trembling from a piece played by a teenage girl in an empty, dimly lit hall on a rainy afternoon. The girl turned her head slightly in his direction. She wasn't looking at him, but she was aware of his presence again. A faint, uncertain smile touched her lips, as if she was emerging from a dream and remembering where she was. "It's a very good piano," she said softly, her voice a little husky. "The sound lives for a long time here." That simple statement, about the piano's echo, broke the spell in a new way. It was such a practical, sensory observation. It grounded the moment. She wasn't waiting for praise. She was noting the quality of the instrument, like a craftsman appreciating a good tool. Victor finally found his voice, but it came out rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. "Yes," he managed. It was all he could say. The question he needed to ask next felt like the most important question he had asked anyone in years. He took a slow, quiet breath, trying to steady the world which had just tilted on its axis. "Who?" he began, then cleared his throat. "Who taught you to play like that?" The simple question seemed to hang in the air, mixing with the last echoes of the music. The girl's head tilted, a thoughtful gesture. The bright, focused energy that had filled her during the piece was settling now, replaced by a quieter, more present calm. "Mostly listening," she said. Her voice was clear, but there was a hint of something else in it now, a carefulness, as if she was used to people not quite understanding. "At first, it was my grandmother's old records. She had this big wooden cabinet with a player. The sound was all scratchy, but I loved it. She'd put on Chopin, Beethoven. I'd sit on the floor with my ear almost touching the speaker." Victor nodded, forgetting she couldn't see the gesture. He stayed perfectly still, leaning against the solid bulk of the piano, afraid that any movement might break the spell of her telling. "At my school," she continued, her fingers gently brushing the edge of the keyboard, not pressing any keys, just feeling the seam between the ivory and ebony. "There's an old upright in the common room. It's out of tune, and the middle C sticks sometimes. But after classes, they let me practice. I'd go through the pieces I remembered from the records. It was like solving a puzzle by ear, finding the shapes my hands needed to make to rebuild the sounds in my head. She said it so plainly, but Victor's mind recoiled at the complexity of it. To learn Rachmaninoff with its dense chords, its wide leaps, its intricate emotional architecture entirely by ear, on a broken-down piano, it was like someone describing how they learned to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, by feeling the cracks in their bedroom wall. "Did no one give you lessons? Formal training?" he asked, trying to keep the disbelief out of his voice. The girl gave a small, one-shouldered shrug. "A teacher from the community center came for a while. He was kind. He taught me scales, some basic exercises. But he moved away after a few months." She paused, and her face became more guarded. "After that, my parents, they talked to a few teachers. But it's expensive, and..." She trailed off, her hand finally coming to rest in her lap. "And?" Victor prompted gently, though he felt he already knew the answer. "And," she said, the words soft but edged with a resignation that no teenager should have to carry. "They said it was a nice hobby, but that it wasn't a practical path. For someone like me." She didn't sound bitter, just matter of fact. It was the sound of a dream being folded up and put away, because there was no room for it in the real world. A hot, sharp feeling rose in Victor's chest. It was anger, but it was so mixed with a fierce, protective awe that it left him breathless. "For someone like me." The phrase echoed in the grand hall, sounding more offensive than any boo or bad review he had ever received. This gift, this staggering, natural voice, was being discussed in terms of practicality. He thought of the hundreds of merely competent students he had encountered at elite conservatories, their paths smoothed by money and connections, their passion often a pale thing next to theirs. And here was this girl, with a direct line to the heart of the music, being told the road was closed. The trembling in his hands had stopped, replaced by a solid, heavy certainty. He looked at her, really looked. He saw not a blind girl, but a musician in exile. He saw the careful way she had felt the piano before playing, not because she was unfamiliar, but because she was mapping it. Her blindness wasn't a limitation in her music. It was the condition that had created her unique, profound way of accessing it. She didn't see the black and white keys as a visual grid. She felt them as a topography under her fingers, a landscape of ridges and smooth plains that led to valleys of low, rumbling sound and peaks of bright, clear notes. She heard the music not as something outside herself to be copied, but as a country she lived inside of. "That piece," Victor said, his voice low. "You didn't just play the notes. You understood it. The loneliness in it. The anger." She seemed surprised he had mentioned the feeling. "It always felt that way to me," she said simply. "The recording I learned it from. The pianist took it very fast, like a storm. But when I finally found the chords myself, on that old upright, it felt slower, heavier, like someone carrying a big weight up a hill, like someone carrying a big weight." Victor had to close his eyes for a second. That was it. That was the interpretation he had just heard, put into the simplest, most human terms. She wasn't performing Rachmaninoff. She was translating a feeling she already knew into his language. "Would you?" He hesitated. He wanted to ask for more, but it felt greedy. Yet, he had to know. "Would you play something else? Not something you learned, something of your own?" Now she looked truly taken aback. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "My own it's nothing really. Just little things, please," Victor said. The word came out as more of a plea than a request. It was the tone he used when asking a fellow master musician for a private performance. She hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting together. Then, shyly, she turned back to the piano. She took a long, settling breath, her shoulders relaxing. This time, her search across the keys was different. It wasn't the confident placement for a known piece. It was exploratory, like someone feeling their way through a dark room they knew was home. She started with a single, high note, pure and clean as water. Then another, a third below, creating a small, questioning interval. The melody that began to unwind was fragile at first, tentative. It danced in the upper register, light and skipping, but there was a melancholy shadow under it, a soft, rumbling chord in the left hand that moved like a deep, slow current. Victor listened, and the world outside the hall, the rain, the upcoming concert, his own fatigue, all of it dissolved. This was not Rachmaninoff's storm. This was something entirely new. It was the sound of curiosity. It was the musical equivalent of fingers tracing the edge of a face, or sunlight falling in patterns on skin. It had no formal structure he could name, but it had a flawless, instinctive logic. It would rise with a flutter of hopeful notes, then retreat into a warmer, safer cluster of sound. It was playful and lonely, all at once. It was, he realized, her sound. It was the sound of her world, a world built not on sight, but on touch, on echo, on the memory of a grandmother's scratchy records, on the feel of a sticky middle C key. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and it was happening right here, in this empty space, just for him. As the last of her own gentle notes faded, she kept her hands in her lap, head bowed as if listening to their ghost. Victor did not tremble this time. The shock had solidified into a deep, unshakable conviction. The awe was still there, a hum in his veins, but it was now joined by a clear, sharp purpose. The anger he felt earlier was no longer a hot spark. It was a cold, hard resolve that this could not be the end of the story. This moment in the empty hall could not be the pinnacle of her musical life. It had to be the beginning. The injustice of it was too great. The gift was too precious to be left in the dark, with only a broken-down upright piano and the word impractical as its audience. He looked at the girl, sitting so quietly on the bench, completely unaware that she had just rewritten the entire score of his evening, and perhaps a part of his life. He knew what he had to do. The how was a problem for later, but the what was now the only thing in the world that mattered. The silence after her own melody felt different. It was a softer quiet, like the air after a light rain. The girl sat with her head slightly bowed, as if listening for an echo that only she could hear. A faint, self-conscious smile touched her lips. "It doesn't really have an end," she murmured, almost to herself. "It just finds a place to stop." Victor found he couldn't speak right away. Words felt too clumsy, too small for what was in the room. What could he say? That was beautiful. It was, but it was like calling the ocean wet. It missed the entire point. Instead, he moved. He walked slowly from his spot by the piano and sat on the edge of the stage, a few feet from the bench, lowering himself to her level. The grand, imposing distance between the maestro and the visitor was gone. He wanted to be in the same space, talking, not performing. "That piece," he began, his voice carefully even. "The one you just played. It's yours. You made that." She nodded, the shy smile returning. "I just make things up sometimes. When I'm trying to figure out how I feel about something. It's easier than words. That," Victor said, "is what music is for. That's its real job." He paused, choosing his words like stepping stones across a fast river. "What you played before, the Rachmaninoff, you learned it by listening. You rebuilt it from the inside out. But this is coming straight out. No one is in between." He could see her absorb this. No one had ever talked to her about her music this way. They had talked about it as a skill, a hobby, a nice trick, not as a language. "Can I ask your name?" Victor said gently. "Elara," she said. "Elara," he repeated. The name suited her. Something classic and a little bit celestial. "My name is Victor." There was a beat of silence. Then he saw the realization dawn on her face. Her head tilted, her brows drawing together in a frown of intense concentration. "Victor Kellen," she whispered. The name of the world-famous pianist was on the posters all over the city, had been announced on the radio. Her uncle, the caretaker, had surely mentioned who was performing tonight. "Yes," he said simply. Her hands flew to her mouth. All the calm composure she had held while wrestling with Rachmaninoff's storm vanished in a second. She looked utterly horrified. "Oh, no, I just played for Victor Kellen. I played Rachmaninoff for you. I'm so sorry. I must have sounded. I didn't know." Her distress was so genuine it almost broke Victor's heart. He held up a hand, even though she couldn't see it. "Elara, stop. Please, look at me." She stilled, her face pale. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You gave me the most honest performance I have heard in years. You reminded me of something I think I had forgotten." She was breathing quickly, trying to process this. The kind stranger was the maestro. The impossible had happened. You're not just saying that?" Victor let out a short, soft laugh that held no humor, only wonder. "I am a man who has paid a great deal of money to have opinions about piano playing. I am not in the habit of giving false praise. It's bad for business." He leaned forward a little. "What you have is not just good technique or a good ear. Those things can be taught. What you have is a voice, a real, true musical voice. And that is the one thing that cannot be taught. It is only given." Elara listened, her earlier embarrassment slowly being replaced by a dawning, bewildered hope. It was a fragile thing, like the first green shoot after a long winter. afraid to believe the sun is really warm. But she started, then stopped, the practical world rushing back in. The lessons, the teachers, my parents. Let me worry about that, Victor said, and the tone in his voice had changed. It was no longer just wonder or kindness. It was the tone of a man who made things happen. It was the voice that commanded orchestras. How would you like to play a piano that is always in tune, in a room where the only thing that matters is the sound? Her face answered for her. It was a look of pure, unguarded longing. It was the look of someone who has been thirsty for a long time being shown a clear, cold spring. She nodded, unable to form words. Good, Victor said. He stood up, his mind already clicking into motion, plans slotting into place. I have to perform tonight. And you, he said, a new, kind but firm note entering his voice. You are going to be in the audience. Your uncle will find you a seat. I will make sure of it. I want you to listen, not as a fan. Listen as a musician. Okay, she breathed, still in a daze. He began to walk towards the backstage area, his steps purposeful. Then he stopped and turned back. She was still sitting on the bench, one hand resting on the piano, as if to steady herself in a spinning world. Elara, he called. She turned her head toward his voice. Thank you for the gift of your music today. It was an honor. Before she could reply, he was gone, the side door swinging shut softly behind him. The hall felt empty again, but it was a different kind of empty. It was full of the memory of sound, and now, full of a new, impossible possibility. Elara sat for a long time, her fingers tracing the familiar landscape of the keys. But now every ridge and plane felt charged with a new kind of potential. That evening, the Emerson Hall was a different universe. It was a world of light and velvet, of the rustle of fine clothes and the low, excited hum of 1,000 conversations. Elara sat in a seat near the front, her uncle's large, reassuring hand patting her shoulder once before he went back to his duties. She was dressed in her best clothes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The lights dimmed. The hum died to a breathless silence. A single spotlight cut through the dark, illuminating the grand piano. Victor Kellen walked on stage. The applause was thunderous, a wave of admiration that crashed over him. He gave his usual, slight bow, his face a mask of professional calm. He sat, he adjusted the bench, he placed his hands in his lap for a moment, gathering himself. Then he began his program. He played with his renowned brilliance, his power, his exquisite control. The music was technically flawless, emotionally profound. The audience was enthralled. But Elara listened differently. She heard the spaces between the notes he left for the hall to fill. She heard the slight, almost imperceptible sigh of the pedal. She heard the touch sometimes like a paintbrush, sometimes like a hammer. She listened as he had asked her to. As a musician, the concert soared towards its finish. The final piece ended with a magnificent, roaring chord. The hall erupted. People jumped to their feet, shouting, clapping, their approval ringing to the rafters. Victor stood, bowed once, twice, 3 times. The applause did not weaken. He held up a hand, and slowly, the noise subsided into an expectant murmur. Encores were a given, but the choice was always a surprise. He stepped to the front of the stage, close to the edge. He didn't smile. His expression was serious, almost solemn. Thank you, he said, his voice amplified but intimate in the now quiet hall. You are a wonderful audience. Before I play one last piece, I would like to say something. Earlier today, in this hall when it was dark and empty, I met a remarkable young musician. She reminded me, in the simplest and most powerful way, why we do this, why we need music. It is not for the applause, or the lights. He paused, his gaze seeming to sweep the crowd, though Elara felt, with a sudden, sure instinct, that he was looking right at where she sat. It is for the truth that can only be spoken in sound. This last piece is for her. He returned to the piano, and for his encore, Victor Kellen did not play one of his fiery, show-stopping war horses. He played a slow, tender, and infinitely sad piece by Schumann. It was a piece about memory, and longing, and lost beauty. He played it with a naked vulnerability he was not known for. It was a thank you note, written in music. As the last note faded, Elara, alone in the crowded, cheering darkness, finally understood. She wasn't just a girl who played piano. She was a musician, and a great one had just told the whole world, without saying her name, that she existed. The tears that fell then were not of sadness, but of a recognition so deep it shook her soul. The road ahead was still unknown, shrouded in mist, but for the first time, she knew for certain that there was a road. The roaring applause for Victor's encore finally faded, leaving behind the busy sounds of an audience gathering coats and heading for the exits. The air was filled with the buzz of excited conversation. People chattered about the performance, about the touching dedication, wondering who the mysterious young musician could be. Elara sat perfectly still in her seat, letting the river of people flow around her. Her uncle found her, his hand gentle on her arm. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She just nodded, unable to explain the storm inside her. It wasn't noise. It was a profound, ringing quiet, like the inside of a bell after it has been struck. Backstage was a world of organized chaos. Stagehands moved scenery, and well-dressed guests waited in a roped-off area, hoping to congratulate the maestro. Victor, still in his concert clothes, moved through it all with a polite but distant energy. He accepted handshakes and compliments with a nod, but his eyes were searching. When he finally saw Elara and her uncle being ushered through by a security guard he'd personally instructed, he excused himself immediately. He led them away from the crowd, into a small, quiet room used for tuning the instruments. The sounds of the departing audience became a distant murmury "Thank you for coming," Victor said to Elara's uncle, shaking his hand firmly. "You have an extraordinary niece." Her uncle, a practical man who knew pipes and floorboards more than pianos, just nodded, a bit overwhelmed. "She loves it. Always has." Victor then turned to Elara. In the bright light of the room, she looked younger, the enormity of the evening showing in the slight tremble of her hands. "You listened," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she whispered. "I heard the difference." "What difference?" "Between playing the music and letting the music play you," she said, finding the words slowly. "You did both. Tonight, in the last piece, you let it play you." Victor felt a lump form in his throat. She had heard everything. She had understood the message in his encore. This was the conversation he never got to have, not even with the most respected critics. "Exactly," he said, his voice thick. He cleared his throat, becoming businesslike, not out of coldness, but because he needed to build a bridge for her from this magical evening to the reality of tomorrow. "Now, we must talk about what comes next. You have a gift, Elara, a serious one. It needs care. It needs training, not to change your voice, but to give it the strength to speak as loudly as it needs to." He saw the shadow of the old, practical objections cross her face. "But my parents, the cost." Victor held up a hand. "I have already made some calls. There is a school, a conservatory. They have a program for exceptionally gifted young musicians. They have teachers who understand that talent does not see the world in only one way." He leaned forward. "I have spoken to the director. They are expecting to hear from your parents. A full scholarship, Elara, for everything. Lessons, housing, the best instruments to practice on. All of it." Elara's breath hitched. Her uncle squeezed her shoulder. A silent "I told you so" that was filled with pride. "It would mean leaving home," Victor said gently, acknowledging the price. "It would mean very hard work. It will not always feel like it did today on the stage. It will feel like scales and exercises and frustration. But it will be a path, a real one." Tears spilled silently down Elara's cheeks, but she was smiling. It was the smile of a prisoner seeing the open door for the first time. She nodded vigorously, wiping her face with her sleeve. "Yes, please, I want to. More than anything." "Good," Victor said, a satisfied smile touching his own lips. "Then my job tonight is only half done. The other half begins tomorrow." And it did. The next morning, Victor Kellen, instead of flying to his next glamorous engagement, sat in the modest, warm living room of Elara's family. He drank tea from a simple mug and spoke not as a celebrity, but as a craftsman who had found a rare and precious material. He talked to her parents about their daughter's gift not as a fairy tale, but as a serious commitment. He assured them of the scholarship, of the school's supportive environment, of his own personal guidance as her mentor. He saw the worry in their eyes, the fear for their daughter going into a world they didn't know, and he addressed it with patience and respect. He wasn't taking her away. He was giving her a map to a country she was already destined for. The story, of course, did not stay secret. A stagehand had overheard a snippet of conversation. A reporter, curious about the maestro's mysterious dedication, asked the right person. A week later, a small article appeared in the arts section of the city paper. Maestro's rainy day discovery. A prodigy found in empty hall. But for Elara, the headlines were just noise. The real story was in the feel of the piano keys at the conservatory, a beautiful, responsive instrument that was hers to use anytime. It was in the patient, brilliant teacher Victor had chosen for her. A woman who didn't just correct her fingering, but asked, "What are you trying to say with this phrase?" It was in the struggle to learn Braille music notation, to give names to the shapes she already knew by heart. It was hard, just as Victor had warned. There were days of tears and slammed key covers, but there was always the music, pulling her forward. For Victor, the story became a quiet source of renewal. His own performances took on a new depth. Critics wrote that he seemed reinvigorated, playing with a newfound vulnerability. He knew why. He had been reminded that music existed before fame, in quiet, honest places. He became a fierce and private advocate for Alara, listening to her practice recordings over the phone, guiding her repertoire, shielding her from the media glare he knew would crush her spirit if it came too soon. Years later, Alara would give her first major solo recital at a prestigious concert hall. It was not the Emerson, but another, equally revered. Victor sat in the front row, not as her mentor that night, but simply as an audience member. She walked on stage, her steps confident, her hand lightly touching the arm of a technician who then faded away. She played a program that was both brave and beautiful. Classics, yes, but also a modern piece, and finally, as her encore, a composition of her own. It was a piece that had grown from the fragile, curious melody she had played for a stranger in the dark years before. Now it was mature, complex, a breathtaking journey through landscapes of sound only she could originally map. The applause was a physical force, a celebration of a musician who had arrived, fully formed, with a voice utterly and uniquely her own. After the last bow, in the dressing room filled with flowers, Victor embraced her. No words were needed. The journey that had begun with a simple, kind offer, just for fun, had led here, to this shared moment of completion and beginning. He had not created her talent. That was hers alone, a seed born in darkness and nurtured by sound. All he had done was open the door to the light, and she, with her fearless heart and listening hands, had walked through, changing the music world. And the man who found her, forever,